Imagine a princess people were afraid to truly love because she always played by her own rules. A woman who could have simply been a royal ornament, yet chose to turn a piece of jewelry into her personal weapon. She fascinated, provoked, broke unspoken rules, and never apologized for it. She owned one of the most controversial pieces of jewelry in British royal history, a tiara she wore to marry a commoner, and in which she was photographed in a scene so provocative that even decades later, the image is rarely shown in full. That photo sent silent shockwaves through the royal family, even though, on the surface, there was nothing overtly scandalous about it. This is the story of how one tiara became a symbol of rebellion against the entire royal system, how it vanished without a trace, and why even now people hesitate to speak about it openly. You might think you know what true royal power looks like, but wait until the end of this video. That's when you'll see what real freedom looks like. She never aspired to the throne. Unlike her older sister, Queen Elizabeth II, Princess Margaret knew from an early age that the crown would never be hers. And yet, she became one of the most captivating and talked about figures in the British royal family of the 20th century. Not because of power, diplomacy, or royal duty, but because of her remarkable personality, impeccable taste, and her ability to bend the rules with the grace of an artist rather than the force of a rebel. They called her the spare princess, the understudy, the alternative in case something happened to the queen. But Margaret never treated that role as a burden. Instead, she turned it into a platform for freedom. She didn't try to be perfect, didn't live in her sister's shadow, and never molded herself to fit expectations. She built her own image, refined, radiant, dramatic, and, at times, provocatively bold. She knew how to command attention without crossing the line into disgrace. Every time she appeared in public, it was an event. People didn't just watch her, they waited for her. They compared, commented, copied. She was a true style icon, and her aesthetic choices shaped more than fashion. They challenged how femininity, elegance, and independence were perceived within the rigid walls of royalty. Towering hairstyles, elegant dresses, striking jewelry. Every detail was chosen with the precision of a jeweler. And it wasn't just about the surface, it was a reflection of who she was. The same woman who could push boundaries and never once say sorry for it. Photographers adored her. She seemed made for the lens, always knowing exactly how to hold herself. There was something cinematic about her, almost theatrical, yet never artificial. Cameras caught her gaze, sometimes cool, sometimes playful, sometimes defiant, and that look captivated millions. But Margaret wasn't just a face of her time, she was its voice, not through speeches, but through presence, through gestures, fashion, and a quiet refusal to conform. Her choices in partners, in fashion, in jewels, all sent a message. I may not be queen, but I'm still a princess, on my terms. There was something about her that inspired admiration, not just from the British public, but from the highest social circles. She moved between two worlds, tradition and change, and somehow made them meet. If Elizabeth was the symbol of stability, Margaret was the symbol of spirit. She carried the elegance of aristocracy, but with a pulse of modern rebellion. Her presence at balls, premieres, diplomatic receptions, and opera galas always reminded people of her unique role, not just as a royal, but as a bridge between centuries. She wasn't afraid to stand out, and it was that fearless individuality that made the public not only respect her, but adore her. But there was something else that deepened her magnetism, her relationship with jewelry, especially one piece in particular, not just an accessory, but a silent witness to some of the boldest, most personal, and most unforgettable moments of her life. A tiara. But not just any tiara, one she didn't inherit, one that wasn't gifted by the crown, one that didn't pass down from mother to daughter. This was a tiara Margaret chose. She bought it, and in that choice was everything you needed to know about her: free, daring, decisive. The story of that tiara is the story of Margaret herself, a story of style, rebellion, and living by your own rules. She caught their attention before she even spoke a word. At a royal reception in honor of the Shah of Iran in the spring of 1959, surrounded by dozens of guests in glittering evening gowns and medals, all eyes turned to her. A white gown, sculpted silhouette, regal posture. But the true centerpiece wasn't the dress. It was something gleaming above it, a tiara no one had seen before. That tiara would soon become legendary, the Poltimore. At first glance, it looked like a classic Victorian piece: restrained sparkle, refined geometry, antique-cut diamonds. But in Princess Margaret's hands, it transformed into something more. This was no mere ornament. The tiara became an extension of her spirit, proud, independent, unapologetically bold. And its power wasn't just in its appearance, it was in how it came into her possession. Because in 1959, royal women didn't buy their own jewelry. In aristocratic circles, especially within the monarchy, jewels were gifted, passed down, loaned, inherited. They were tokens of legacy, never personal purchases. But Margaret didn't care about conventions. When she saw the tiara in an auction catalog, she didn't wait for approval. She didn't hint, suggest, or ask. She bought it herself for £5,500, a considerable amount at the time, but she knew exactly what she was doing. The Poltimore tiara was crafted in 1870 by the London jeweler House of Garrett, the same firm responsible for crafting crowns and regalia for generations of British royalty. It had been commissioned by Lady Poltimore, the wife of the second Baron Poltimore. Its construction was extraordinary. The piece could be worn as a traditional tiara or cleverly disassembled into a necklace and 11 brooches. That practicality, designed for 19th century socialites, ended up perfectly aligning with the rebellious versatility of a 20th century princess. For decades, the tiara was passed through the Poltimore family. It graced coronations, balls, and court appearances. But time, as it often does, reshuffled its value. Eventually, the piece went to auction. It could have ended up in a museum, or been broken apart and sold stone by stone. But instead, fate placed it in the hands of someone who would not only wear it, but give it a new life. From the moment it entered her collection, the tiara became a signature part of Margaret's public image. She wore it to state banquets, official visits, theater galas, and diplomatic dinners. The Poltimore followed her around the world, from London to Lisbon, Paris to Tokyo. It stopped being a royal jewel and became her tiara. Few pieces of jewelry in history have ever been so closely linked to one person. But perhaps the most unforgettable and defiant moment associated with the Poltimore was her wedding day. Margaret wore it when she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a young photographer with no noble blood, no title, no aristocratic lineage. At the time, this was unthinkable. Most European royals were so scandalized they refused to attend. Only the Queen of Denmark accepted the invitation. The rest stayed away, considering the match beneath their dignity. But Margaret, as always, stayed true to herself. She married for love, without apology, without permission. And the tiara? It shone brighter than ever, not just as a crown, but as a declaration, a glittering symbol of a choice made from the heart, not tradition. But even that bold wedding moment wasn't the height of the tiara's story. Its most iconic and controversial chapter came years later in the form of a single photograph, a photo that would forever change how the world viewed the tiara. A photo that was never meant to be seen by the public. A photo that, to this day, is whispered about in royal circles. And from that moment on, the Poltimore would no longer be remembered as just a beautiful object, but as a living legend. The photograph was taken in the early 1960s. In it, Princess Margaret is lying in a bathtub, completely at ease. Her hair slightly tousled, her expression playful and calm, her eyes locked on someone just outside the frame. On her head, the Poltimore tiara gleaming as regally as ever. But this time, there was nothing else adorning her. No gown, no jewels, just the tiara. In the mirror, the reflection of a man holding a camera comes into view. It's her husband, Anthony Armstrong Jones, by then already a celebrated photographer and soon to be the Earl of Snowdon. He captured a moment of vulnerability, intimacy, and quiet confidence. There was no vulgarity in the shot. On the contrary, it was composed with grace, softness, and elegance. But that didn't stop it from becoming one of the most quietly explosive images in royal history. For decades, the photo remained hidden from the public eye. It was a private image, never meant to be shared, a symbol of trust, intimacy, and the unique relationship between two unconventional people. But in 2006, after Margaret's passing, Lord Snowdon decided to release it. The world was stunned. Not because the image was explicit, it wasn't, but because it shattered the carefully curated perception of royalty. This wasn't a formal portrait, it wasn't a gala appearance or a posed official engagement. It was a woman, a wife, a princess, wearing nothing but a tiara, gazing lovingly at her husband from the sanctuary of her own bath. British media, typically cautious when it came to royal affairs, didn't know how to respond. The image was published in a censored version, modest in appearance, yet loaded with meaning. There was no scandalous content in the traditional sense, but the mere existence of the photo challenged everything people thought they knew about the private life of a royal. Because it wasn't about nudity, it was about context. The Poltimore tiara, once a symbol of Victorian formality, aristocratic ceremony, and public duty, was now at the center of something deeply personal. It wasn't being worn at a state banquet or a royal ball. It was resting on the head of a woman in her most unguarded moment. The tiara had become a statement, not of royalty, but of freedom. And that's what made the image so powerful. Margaret wasn't delivering speeches, she didn't write manifestos, but her choices spoke louder than words. A crown on her head, her body relaxed in the bath, her eyes locked with her husband's. It was a portrait of rebellion wrapped in intimacy, a quiet, stunning defiance of everything expected of her. Public reaction was divided. Some called it disgraceful, accusing her of tarnishing the monarchy's image. Others saw it as a bold declaration of individuality, something profoundly human, artistic, and unfiltered. But whether they loved it or hated it, everyone agreed on one thing: no one had ever seen anything like it. From that moment on, the Poltimore tiara was no longer just a royal jewel. It was the tiara from that photo, a symbol not just of fashion or status, but of a woman claiming her life as her own. And yet, Margaret didn't hide the tiara after the photo's release. She didn't lock it away or try to erase its association with that moment. In fact, she continued to wear it, proudly, at state dinners, galas, and premieres. The tiara hadn't lost its dignity. If anything, it had gained a story. Over time, the press began calling it her unofficial crown, not one bestowed by birth or duty, but one chosen freely. And just as Margaret never became queen but remains unforgettable, Poltimore never sat in the Tower of London, yet it became the most iconic tiara of her time. And what many don't realize is that this legendary photo, the one that changed everything, wasn't the end of the tiara's journey. there were still decades of appearances ahead, still banquets to attend, stages to light up, and rooms to captivate. Because just like its owner, the Poltimore tiara wasn't finished yet. The Poltimore tiara seemed to follow Margaret like a glittering shadow, accompanying her across the globe, silently observing banquets, speeches, and standing ovations. With every new appearance, the jewel gained not just more visibility, but deeper meaning. At diplomatic receptions, opera premieres, and royal galas, it wasn't just part of the outfit, it was a message. And as time went on, its bond with the princess grew inseparable. Its public debut had been that 1959 reception honoring the Shah of Iran, but soon came Portugal, then France, Belgium, the United States, Japan, Sweden, the Philippines. The list goes on. Margaret wore it with the same self-assured poise every time, as if to say, "This is me." The tiara no longer needed an introduction. It had ceased to be just another piece of royal jewelry. It had become her signature. One reason the Poltimore fascinated so deeply was its versatility. It wasn't a rigid crown meant for one type of occasion. It could be transformed, worn as a full tiara, or disassembled into a necklace and 11 separate brooches. Margaret knew how to use this to her advantage. Sometimes she wore it in its full, majestic form, dazzling under chandelier light. Other times, only the necklace, elegant and understated. On certain occasions, just one brooch. Yet for those who knew, the meaning was clear. Poltimore was still there. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the tiara became almost an extension of her silhouette. It accompanied her on state visits to Japan and Sweden, during Queen Elizabeth II's Silver Jubilee, and throughout tours in Asia, America, Oman, and the Netherlands. It felt as if the tiara traveled the world with her, ever present, always shining. Wherever she appeared, it left an impression. But Poltimore didn't only appear at grand occasions. In more intimate settings, private dinners, cultural receptions, personal anniversaries, Margaret continued to weave elements of it into her style. A necklace worn at an embassy banquet, a brooch pinned to a sleek gown at a charity ball, combinations with other royal jewels that felt daring yet harmonious. Each appearance was different, yet unmistakably hers, a perfect blend of tradition and defiance. By the mid-1990s, as her public engagements became less frequent, the tiara remained. It stood as a quiet reminder of who Margaret was and what she had built. A woman who carved out her place within a rigid monarchy without ever compromising her individuality. She had shown that one could remain true to oneself and still belong to the royal world. In those final years, the tiara no longer needed the spotlight. A single flash of its diamonds under camera lights was enough for everyone to understand. The princess was still entirely herself, unchanged, unapologetic, authentically royal in her own way. But even the most dazzling story must eventually change course. The tiara that had lit up opera houses and royal halls was about to enter a new chapter, one where it would vanish from view and become even more powerful in its mystery. When Princess Margaret passed away, everything changed. The world wasn't just saying goodbye to one of the most vivid personalities in the British royal family. It was the end of an era in which style could be a form of rebellion, and a piece of jewelry could quietly symbolize personal freedom. After decades of dazzling appearances, private dinners, operatic galas, and diplomatic receptions, the Poltimore tiara returned to its original home, a deep blue leather box. But not for long. In 2006, 4 years after Margaret's death, her jewelry collection was put up for auction at Christie's in London. The sale included around 800 items: rings, necklaces, brooches, earrings. But only one piece outshined the rest, the undisputed star of the evening, the Poltimore tiara. When the auctioneer spoke its name, the mood in the room shifted. This was no longer about gemstones or carats. It was about history, about memory, about the legacy of a woman who had challenged the royal mold in her own quiet, glamorous way. Its initial estimate between £150,000 and £200,000, but from the first bid, it was clear this tiara would exceed every expectation. The numbers soared. Everyone understood. They weren't bidding on diamonds. They were bidding on a legend. When the hammer finally came down, the tiara had sold for £926,400, nearly $1 million, more than 4 times its highest estimate. The buyer was a private collector from Asia. Their identity remains unknown. And from that moment, the Poltimore tiara vanished from public view. It hasn't been seen since. No exhibitions, no museum displays, no red carpet reappearances. Just gone. Only speculation remains. Where is it now? Who owns it? Will it ever return to the public eye? Its disappearance has only deepened the mystery. But perhaps that's part of its magic. The Poltimore doesn't need to be seen to be remembered. Its brilliance doesn't rely on cameras or displays. Its power lies in what it represents. The image of Margaret wearing the tiara on her wedding day under the glow of palace chandeliers, during diplomatic galas, or in that unforgettable photo in the bathtub has become part of cultural memory, not just as a royal moment, but as a story where style was a language, beauty was a statement, and freedom came dressed in diamonds. Over the years, the Poltimore has been recreated in films and television, most famously in The Crown, where actresses playing Margaret wore replicas of it. But no reproduction has ever captured what the original carried, because it wasn't just about the gold or the diamonds, it was about the woman who gave it meaning. Margaret is gone, but her legacy remains. And somewhere, in a velvet-lined box, tucked away in some private vault, the tiara still shines. The one that was never just a piece of jewelry. It was a manifesto, a quiet declaration of independence. The crown of a princess who never became a queen, but was never forgotten.